The Stranger at Closing Time, Chapter 1. Jack's Place was a small-town dive bar that time forgot. The floors creaked with every step, the jukebox hummed with old country songs, and the smell of stale beer clung to the walls. Emily, the bartender, had grown used to the predictable rhythm of the place, regulars stumbling in after work, strangers passing through, and the occasional troublemaker who needed to be shown the door. Wednesday nights were always slow. Emily liked it that way it gave her time to clean up early and think about her own life outside the bar. She was wiping down the counter when the door creaked open, and a gust of cold air followed a man into the room. The stranger was tall and gaunt, his face pale as the moonlight. He wore a trench coat that looked older than the jukebox and carried himself with an eerie stillness. He didn't look like the usual crowd that came into Jack's place. He slid into the booth in the far corner, away from the other patrons, and simply sat there. Emily waited a moment before walking over. "Hey there, what can I get you?" she asked with her usual smile. The man looked up at her, his dark eyes piercing. "Just water," he said, his voice low and gravelly. She frowned, but nodded, coming right up. As she poured him a glass of water, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. He didn't look drunk or dangerous, just wrong. When she set the glass on his table, he didn't thank her. Instead, he stared at her for an uncomfortably long time before taking a sip. Chapter 2. Whispers in the corner. The bar emptied out as the night dragged on. By midnight, only a couple of regulars were left, nursing their last drinks. The stranger hadn't moved from his booth, his glass of water barely touched. "Who's the creep?" asked Joe, one of the regulars, as he leaned against the bar. Emily shrugged. "No idea. He's just sitting there. Gives me the creeps, though." Joe chuckled. "Maybe he's one of those ghost hunters. You know, this place is supposed to be haunted." Emily rolled her eyes. She'd heard the stories a million times about the man who died in a fight over a poker game, or the bartender who had supposedly hanged himself in the storage room decades ago. The regulars left by 1 a.m., leaving Emily alone with the stranger. She glanced at the clock, wishing he'd leave so she could close up. But he stayed, silent and motionless, as if waiting for something. "Hey, we're closing soon," she called out, trying to sound firm. The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, as if listening to something only he could hear. Emily's unease deepened. She grabbed her phone, ready to call her manager, when the stranger finally stood up. He walked to the bar and placed a crumpled dollar bill on the counter. "Keep the change," he said, his voice sending a shiver down her spine. "Thanks," she muttered, eager to see him go. But as he walked toward the door, he stopped and turned back to her. His dark eyes locked onto hers. "She shouldn't have taken it," he said cryptically. Then he stepped outside and vanished into the night. Chapter 3. The Forgotten Story. The next morning, Emily couldn't shake the encounter. Who's he talking about? What did he mean? She told her manager about the stranger, but he laughed it off. "You're overthinking it," he said. "People say weird stuff all the time. Probably just some drifter." But Emily wasn't convinced. She started digging through old records, curious about the bar's history. What she found was chilling. In 1983, a man named Frank Wilson had gone missing after a heated argument in Jack's place. He had accused his ex-wife of stealing money from him, and witnesses said he'd stormed out of the bar that night, never to be seen again. Some locals believed he'd been murdered, though his body was never found. Emily's blood ran cold. The description of Frank matched the stranger down to the trench coat. Chapter 4. The haunting begins. The following nights were anything but normal. Patrons began reporting strange occurrences: glasses tipping over by themselves, cold spots near the corner booth, and faint whispers that no one could quite make out. Emily started noticing them too. The jukebox would play songs it hadn't been programmed to play, and sometimes, late at night, she'd hear footsteps when no one was there. One night, as she was closing up alone, she felt a cold breeze brush past her. She turned to see the shadow of a man in the mirror behind the bar, but when she turned around, no one was there. The occurrences grew more intense. One regular claimed he'd seen a man sitting in the corner booth, only for him to vanish when he blinked. Another patron swore he heard someone whisper, "She shouldn't have taken it," directly into his ear. Chapter 5. The confrontation. Emily decided to stay late one night to confront whatever was haunting Jack's place. Armed with a flashlight and a growing sense of dread, she searched the bar for anything out of the ordinary. As she approached the corner booth, the temperature dropped. She saw the glass of water she'd given the stranger still sitting there, untouched. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the jukebox turned on by itself, playing a mournful country tune. Emily froze as the shadow of a man appeared in the booth. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed to the floor beneath the booth. Emily's heart raced as she realized what he meant. She grabbed a crowbar from the storage room and began prying up the floorboards. Beneath them, she found a small, rusted box. Inside was a bundle of old, water-stained bills. Frank Wilson's stolen money. Chapter 6. Restless spirits. As soon as Emily found the money, the hauntings intensified. The jukebox blared, glasses shattered, and a cold wind howled through the bar. Emily knew she had to do something. She took the money to the police, explaining what she had found. The officers reopened Frank Wilson's case and began an investigation. Days later, they discovered Frank's remains buried in the woods behind the bar. The news made headlines, and locals were shocked to learn the truth. But Emily wasn't relieved. The hauntings continued, as if Frank's spirit wasn't satisfied. Chapter 7. The final goodbye. One stormy night, Emily stayed behind after closing. She sat in the corner booth, clutching a photograph she'd found in the box, a picture of Frank and his ex-wife. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to disturb you." The lights flickered, and for a moment, she saw Frank's figure standing before her. His expression softened, and he nodded once before fading into the darkness. From that night on, the hauntings stopped. Jack's place returned to normal, but Emily would never forget the stranger at closing time and the chilling secrets he revealed. The vanishing regular prologue, the rusty tap, had always been more than just a bar. It was a piece of local history. Nestled in the heart of a crumbling industrial town, the establishment had been serving drinks and stories for over a century. The walls, stained with decades of cigarette smoke, held whispers of secrets that only the dim lighting and warped wooden floors could remember. Mike had worked there for 3 years, long enough to learn the names and quirks of the regulars. He wasn't looking for glory or riches. Tending bar was just a way to get by while he figured out his life. But something about the rusty tap felt timeless, like stepping into a place where reality bent just enough to make room for the unexplained. Among the regulars was Gary, an older man, always impeccably dressed in a worn, dark suit and fedora, Gary arrived at exactly 7 p.m. every evening. He'd sit on the same stool at the far end of the bar, nursing a whiskey neat and chatting with anyone who'd listen. His stories, often about the town's heyday, were captivating but tinged with melancholy. But then, Gary vanished. Chapter 1: A Night Like Any Other. It was a cold December evening, and Mike was midway through his shift. The bar was lively but not crowded, the perfect balance for a night when the tips flowed easily, and the atmosphere felt just warm enough to stave off the winter chill outside. Gary walked in at his usual time, the bell above the door jingling softly as he removed his fedora and brushed snow off his shoulders. Mike nodded in greeting, already pouring the whiskey Gary never had to ask for. "Evening, Gary," Mike said, sliding the glass across the counter. "Evening, kid," Gary replied, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He placed a neatly folded $20 bill on the bar, the same way he always did. The two exchanged small talk about the weather and the upcoming holidays. Gary launched into another one of his stories, this time about the bar's jazz club days in the 1950s. He painted a vivid picture of the music, the dancing, and the life that had once filled the space. "You know, back then, this place had soul," Gary said, his voice wistful. "Now, it's just ghosts and shadows." Mike chuckled. "Ghosts? Huh? You trying to scare me off?" Gary's expression darkened for a moment, and his gaze drifted toward the mirror behind the bar. "Not all ghosts are bad, Mike. Some just want to be remembered." Chapter 2: The first sign a week passed, and Gary didn't show up. Mike found it strange, but figured maybe the old man had caught a cold or decided to spend time with family. But as the days stretched into 2 weeks, concern gnawed at him. One quiet night, as Mike was closing up, he noticed something odd. The stool where Gary always sat was damp, as if someone had spilled a drink. But the bar had been empty for hours. Shrugging it off as a fluke, Mike wiped it down. But the next night, the same thing happened. Then, the faint smell of whiskey lingered in the air, even when no drinks had been poured. Chapter 3: The return. 1 month to the day after Gary's last visit, Mike was closing up alone. The bar was silent, except for the hum of the neon sign outside. As he locked the front door, the bell above it jingled. Startled, Mike turned to find the bar empty. But when he looked toward Gary's stool, his heart stopped. The faint outline of a man was sitting there, barely visible but unmistakable in its form. "Gary?" Mike whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but the air grew colder. The faint scent of whiskey grew stronger, and a single word seemed to echo in the stillness: "Help." Chapter 4: The investigation determined to find answers, Mike began asking around. He discovered old newspaper clippings about Gary's tragic past. Decades ago, Gary had been a musician at the bar. He had fallen in love with a singer named Evelyn, but their romance ended in heartbreak when Evelyn disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some said Gary never recovered, and his nightly visits to the bar were his way of clinging to the memory of her. But others whispered darker tales that Gary had been involved in her disappearance and was doomed to haunt the place as penance. Chapter 5: The haunting. Over the following weeks, the activity at the bar intensified. Glasses would shatter without warning. The jukebox, long broken, began playing hauntingly slow jazz tunes. Patrons reported feeling an unseen presence near Gary's stool, and more than one claimed to see a shadowy figure in the mirror behind the bar. Mike started to piece together the clues. He found an old journal hidden in the basement of the bar, filled with Gary's tormented thoughts about Evelyn. The final entry read, "She's still here. I can feel her, but she won't forgive me." Chapter 6. Confrontation. One stormy night, Mike stayed late to confront whatever was haunting the bar. He set up candles around Gary's stool and placed a glass of whiskey in front of it. "If you're here, Gary, talk to me," Mike said aloud. The candles flickered, and the room grew colder. A voice, faint but clear, whispered, "Find her." Epilogue: The haunting stopped the night Mike uncovered Evelyn's body buried beneath the bar's floorboards. The discovery made headlines, and Gary's ghost never appeared again. But even now, late at night, Mike sometimes hears the faint strains of jazz music and wonders if Gary and Evelyn finally found peace, or if they're still dancing in the shadows of the rusty tap. In the mirror, prologue: The Neon Bell, was an old bar with a peculiar centerpiece, a massive antique mirror spanning the back wall. Rumors swirled about its eerie nature shadows that moved on their own, whispers in the dead of night, and a ghostly girl seen by those unlucky enough to stay too late. Lucy, the newest bartender, thought the stories were nonsense until the night she closed up alone. The first encounter, as Lucy wiped the bar, she noticed a shadow in the mirror. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but as she leaned closer, the shadow solidified into the figure of a young girl in a white dress. Lucy spun around, but the bar was empty. When she looked back, the girl was gone. "Just my imagination," Lucy whispered, but the chills running down her spine told her otherwise. The whispers begin over the next few nights. Lucy started hearing whispers, faint but unmistakable, calling her name. They seemed to emanate from the mirror. One night, she mustered the courage to approach it. "Who's there?" she asked. Her reflection warped, and the girl appeared, her face pale and her eyes dark voids. "Help me," the girl whispered. Lucy stumbled back, but the girl's face remained etched in the glass, her expression growing more desperate. The truth behind the mirror, Lucy learned from a patron that the mirror dated back to the 1920s. It was tied to the disappearance of a little girl, the daughter of the bar's original owner. Her body was never found, but her bloodstains had been discovered near the mirror. "People say she's trapped in there," the patron said, lowering his voice. "But sometimes she isn't the one who stays trapped." Trapped in the glass on a stormy night, Lucy stayed late to investigate. As she stared into the mirror, the girl's reflection smiled and whispered, "Switch with me." Before Lucy could react, the mirror shimmered, and a cold force pulled her forward. She screamed as the world flipped. When Lucy woke, she was inside the mirror, staring out at her own reflection. The face looking back at her wasn't hers, it was the girl's, wearing a twisted smile. The new bartender the next day, Lucy was back behind the bar, but she wasn't the same. Her smile was too wide, her eyes too hollow. Regulars noticed, but no one dared to ask. Late at night, patrons say you can see her trapped in the mirror, pounding on the glass. And if you're not careful, the girl might invite you to switch places too.